Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to this event. I think an important moment, especially in the context of ongoing inquiries and investigations. The focus today really is on trying to understand the institutional conditions for improving the performance of the NPA. And the centerpiece is a very important report that has been written by Nicole Fritz. So very looking forward to the presentation and the discussion afterwards. So Nicole Fritz is an affiliate researcher of the New South Institute. She's also a very well-known human rights lawyer, policy advocate, and civil society leader. She's known for her long-standing commitment to constitutionalism, to social justice, and the rule of law. She's currently the executive director of the Campaign for Free Expression, having led several prominent South African and regional civil society initiatives. So, Nicole, it's a great pleasure and great honor to have you and to listen to your engagement in this regard. Dr. Jean Redpath will be joining us too. Is a senior researcher at the Dall'Omo Institute at the University of the Western Cape. She worked at the Scorpions in 1999 as an analyst, and after the Scorpions disbandment, she worked independently on criminal justice issues. She currently serves on the Civilian Oversight Committee of the City of Cape Town and is chairperson of the Provincial Safety Advisory Committee in the Western Cape. It's a great honor, great pleasure to have you, Jean. Lawson Naidoo, again, someone who barely needs an introduction. Lawson Naidoo is the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, CASAC. Been prominent in that role for many, many years. He also served as the Deputy Secretary of the Inquiry into the fitness of Vusi Pikoli to hold office as the NDPP in the 2007-2008 Ginwala inquiry. Lawson, it's a great pleasure, great honor to have you as well. And facilitating the conversation, again, greatly honored to have a great friend of the NSI, I can say, Karen Morn, who's done this for us before, one of South Africa's most important, courageous investigative journalist in South Africa, is currently a reporter for the News 24, best-selling author and documentary producer, and has been involved in some very precedent-setting cases, most recently by being pursued by our former president, Jacob Zuma, for, was it criminal charges, which have, of course, cleared and acquitted in that regard again. So, Karen, great pleasure to have you. I don't want to take anyone's time, just to notice that how this speaks to some of the work that NSI has been doing over the last couple of years. Nicole's initial engagement arose around the appointment of the head of the NPA, and it speaks to a long-standing interest of the New South Institute in appointment processes in the public service and in the state more widely. In 2022, we published, Nicole, Michelle Leroux, myself, and Rafael Leite published a report called Personalizing and Depersonalizing Power, Appointment of Executive Officers in Key State Institutions, which was the first sort of major study of the legislative environment and practices in departments around the appointments of key leading figures, heads of statutory organizations, heads of departments. We discovered two things in that legislative process, in that legislative research. The first one was that in almost every instance, the appointment of the head of those institutions, whether it was a statutory body or head of department, was decided on through a process controlled or led by the executive authority. That was the president himself, or a cabinet minister, or an MEC in provincial government. So the appointment process was a profoundly political process. The second thing, which was most striking, was that in almost every instance, the legislation provided almost no framework or no criteria in the appointment process itself. In other words, it provided no minimum criteria in regard to qualifications and especially of experience. There are a couple of exceptions. The head of the police, for example, needed not to have a criminal record, but apart from that, enormously wide discretion over who was appointed. And what it really spoke to was the fact that the political executive in South Africa was and still has extraordinarily wide discretion to appoint pretty much whoever they want into those key positions without there being constraints in terms of qualifications or experience. And this is why this conversation is so important, because of the huge importance of the NPA in our political lives, but it speaks to more broadly around the state of the state in South Africa. So let me just end by saying, in this regard, there's been a major breakthrough since we wrote that report in 2022. NSI, together with some extraordinary and very impressive senior officials in key government departments, helped pioneer an amendment to the Public Service Act. Public Service Act is the piece of legislation which in Section 3 empowers the executive authority to have discretion over all appointments in government departments, and also all discretion over powers over operational decisions. So it's really the foundational piece of legislation which creates an environment, a highly politicized environment over our public administrations. The end of last year, November, an amendment to that piece of legislation passed through the parliamentary cycle. I think it's a historic moment, a landmark development. It's now sitting on President Ramaphosa's desk, and we are hoping that he will sign it shortly. He mentioned it specifically in the SONA address. So this is a very exciting moment where if it is signed, it becomes law. I think it opens up what I've called elsewhere South Africa's third transition. We became a democracy in 1994. We became a constitutional state in 1996. And when this legislation is passed, I think, and becomes fully operational, I think it's the beginning of our transition towards a modern professional administration. So that, I think, is the broad context for this conversation. It's a one of great optimism, I think, going forward. And even though NPA has been a site of tremendous contestation and of disappointment, I think the conversation is happening in a context of broad optimism, I regard, in my mind, around reform of government. On that note, I'm going to hand over to Karen, who will be facilitating this conversation. And I'm looking very much forward to the conversation, and I'm very glad for people to have joined us online. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think it's very important for us to look at this appointment process and how it played out, because we saw the Ramaphosa administration in the appointment of Shamila Batoy, which of course now is the concept, facing certain litigation in regards from the MKP. But we sort of saw this idea that this was going to be an open and transparent process, that the best of the best would be vying for this position. And then at in this latest turn of events, despite the clear importance of the NDPP to a constitutional democracy, where we see rule of law under continuous attack because of various corruption scandals, we then have an interview process where someone like Menzi Simelane, who, of course, Lawson will know very well because of the way in which he was a witness and a participant in the Ginwala inquiry where Simelane was so thoroughly disgraced, is then seemingly shortlisted, not shortlisted for that position, and all kinds of questions are raised about the legitimacy of that process. Given all that, I'm going to just pave the way for Nicole to address the kind of issues that she's raised in this particular research that she's done, and then we will engage with what she has brought to the fore. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thanks to the New South Institute and Iva especially for hosting this launch and the event today. Thank you to Delani for all your work behind the scenes to make this happen. Thanks especially to Lawson and to Jean. Always a great privilege to have people who are so well regarded in this field be willing to engage with this research. So thank you for that. And thank you very much to Karen for agreeing to facilitate this. I am going to take my 25 minutes to walk you through essentially the brief that I have written to explain why, despite recent events, I believe it speaks to an urgent concern. The title is Appointing the Next National Director of Public Prosecutions, Vital but Itself Insufficient to Guarantee Turnaround. That is the thesis. The National Prosecuting Authority cannot be renewed by a single appointment, however unimpeachable the appointee's integrity or professional excellence. But the choice of the NDPP still decisively shapes whether the NPA can recover its constitutional purpose. As Lawson wrote during an earlier stage of this debate, the appointment, as presented itself at the end of last year, represents the first opportunity for a managed and orderly transition to the next NDPP, and it is one that should not be spurned. The point of my brief is to insist that we do not spurn that opportunity by treating the appointment as a stand-in for institutional reform or by running a process that is procedurally transparent but substantively thin. Now, in one sense, events have moved beyond the scenario anticipated by the brief. The panel, as I've indicated, convened in December 2025 and was unable to recommend a single candidate to the president. The President then appointed Advocate Andy Matibi, formerly head of the Special Investigating Unit, and he has taken office as from the 1st of February 2026. But because the National Prosecuting Authority Act requires retirement of the NDPP at 65, and Advocate Matibi is reportedly aged 63, we are already living in the reality of a very short tenure, at most, probably 24 months. That makes this brief paradoxically both overtaken by events and also perfectly timeless. It is overtaken because the appointment has happened, but it is timeless because the 24-month horizon means that the next appointment cycle is effectively already on the horizon. If reforms are not now set in motion, if we do not build on the diagnostic foundations and redesign the process to be reform-oriented, then we will return to the very same moment soon, with the same vulnerabilities, the same institutional ambiguity, and the same public skepticism. With that framing, let me move through the brief structure. First, the process, second, the context, third, the missing diagnostic and what it must address, and finally, the immediate steps the Presidency and the Department of Justice should be taking to ensure that the next phase of NDPP succession becomes a lever for institutional recovery rather than a turn of the wheel. The process. On the 7th of October 2025, President Ramaphosa announced a panel to oversee the selection of the next National Director of Public Prosecutions, necessitated by Advocate Shamila Batoy's term ending in January 2026. The panel, chaired by Minister of Justice Mameloko Kubai, included the chairs of the South African Human Rights Commission, the Commission of Gender Equality, the Auditor General, the Chair of the Public Service Commission, and representatives from the Black Lawyers Association and the National Association of Democratic Lawyers. The panel was tasked to call for nominations, conduct shortlisting and interviews, and submit the names of 3 recommended candidates with a detailed report. It had 3 months in which to do so. A public call for nominations was published on 18th of October 2025. It restated the statutory minima for the office: citizenship, legal qualifications to practice in all courts, and integrity, conscientiousness, and fitness for office. It added the new requirement, at least 10 years of executive management experience. It reiterated the NDPP's statutory functions and noted the 10-year non-renewable term. The process was clearly intended to echo the 2018 appointment process that led to Shamila Batoy's appointment. It presented itself as open, participatory, and anchored in bodies associated with constitutional oversight, rather than partisan politics. The difficulty, and this is where the brief is blunt, is that this continuity is also a continuity of omission. The panel's composition and the terms of the process gave no indication that the deeper lessons of the last 7 years had been absorbed. The criteria remained essentially at the level of statutory minima and did not grapple with what the next NDPP would actually inherit: an institution that is depleted, factional, deeply demoralized, and plausibly compromised. There was no clear signal that the candidates would be assessed on their capacity to lead institutional recovery, to manage entrenched internal resistance, or to confront bad faith actors, those who were not simply lacking in skills, but deliberately obstructive. The panel also lacked direct prosecutorial operational expertise and experience in leading institutional turnarounds. Constitutional credibility is valuable, but it does not substitute for the ability to test the hard operational questions that are central to the NPA's rehabilitation: how to restore morale, how to rebuild prosecutorial capacity, how to enforce discipline when disciplinary mechanisms are sluggish at best, how to align the different divisions, and how to work with police structures that are themselves deeply contested. The 3-month timeline compounded that risk. A process of this magnitude, requiring the identification not merely of a person of integrity, but an architect of institutional reform, risked being compressed into an administrative exercise. And in truth, the panel's subsequent inability to recommend any candidate is consistent with that diagnosis. A process designed around procedural legitimacy struggled when confronted with the substantive difficulty of identifying a credible recovery candidate for an institution in the condition in which we find the National Prosecuting Authority. The brief makes one further point here that is critical. Any credible candidate should recognize and be assessed on their recognition that genuine recovery cannot hinge on a solitary appointment. Renewal will require a collective renewal of leadership, filling vacant senior posts with a cohort of trusted prosecutors aligned to a shared reformed mandate. The capacity to assemble, empower, and defend such a leadership team should form part of the selection test for the NDPP role itself. Moving to the next section, the context. The appointment process unfolded and today continues to unfold at a moment of acute crisis in the criminal justice system. When the president described the NDPP role as vital, he was correct. But it is a significant understatement. We are not dealing with ordinary succession. We are dealing with an appointment into a system whose upper echelons are in disarray, if not collapse, not only within the SAPS, but within the NPA itself. The allegations made by General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, claims of corruption, collusion with criminal syndicates, and unlawful interference precipitated the establishment of the Madlanga Commission and a parallel ad hoc parliamentary process. Even as these processes promise to expose institutional rot, they also reveal instability in the policing and the intelligence environment. It is not implausible that these allegations themselves may be entangled in deep factional struggles, but the core concern that criminal influence and patronage networks have penetrated key nodes of our criminal justice system is depressingly plausible. And the National Prosecuting Authority is not insulated from that dysfunction. Mkhwanazi's disclosures mentioned compromised prosecutors, bought, intimidated, co-opted by criminal networks. The National Prosecuting Authority, severely crippled by Zuma-era capture, has struggled to rid itself of those loyalties. While the President has acted to suspend Andrew Chalke, prosecutor within Gauteng, a chief prosecutor within Gauteng, and establish an inquiry into his fitness, the legacy of Nomqoba Jiba and Lawrence Mukhwebi and Sean Abrahams is not fully extinguished, and the culture of mistrust and bureaucratic caution remains. So the criminal justice system is implicated in a legitimacy crisis. The police cannot be relied upon for credible investigation. The prosecutorial service is not the anchor of independence it is constitutionally designed to be, and coordination between the two has eroded under the weight of mutual suspicion. This matters not only for public safety and constitutional principle, but for political stability. A functioning criminal justice system is not a luxury. It is a precondition for social trust, economic confidence, the rule of law. And the brief notes a striking indicator of what legitimacy erosion can produce. A recent Afrobarometer survey suggests that public sentiment in favor of military rule has risen sharply in the past 3 years, jumping from 28% in 2022 to 49% in favor of military rule in the last year. That's not merely a statistic, it is a warning about what institutional failure does to democratic culture. Against that backdrop, the next National Director of Public Prosecutions inherits not only a depleted prosecutorial authority, but a justice system in need of reconstitution. The mandate cannot be limited to formal independence and managerial competence. It must encompass institutional reconstruction, rebuilding integrity inside the National Prosecuting Authority, and re-establishing cooperative functionality with compromised investigative institutions, and restoring the public credibility of the state's capacity to prosecute without fear or favor. The next section looks at the missing diagnostic. The brief makes what I believed to be its most important institutional point. The appointment process proceeded without any systematic diagnostic of the institution that the incoming National Director of Public Prosecutions would be expected to lead. The compressed timeline made such a diagnostic difficult, but the absence of a diagnostic means that the process risked being non-credible. It is extremely difficult to evaluate whether someone is fit and proper for an office if you do not have the defined institutional context and the factual challenges that the office now entails. The Ginwala Commission's framing is important here. It maintained that fit and proper is context-specific. Whether a person is fit and proper depends on the context in which the notion is used. South Africa already possesses a deep evidentiary record on the National Prosecuting Authority's decay. The commission headed by Justice Mokgoro, the Zondo Commission, court rulings, annual reports, and detailed public commentary all go to that deep evidentiary record. The task is not revelation, it is synthesis, assembling the existing findings into a coherent diagnostic framework to guide the selection of leadership. And there are people on this panel representing organizations that would be well placed to have provided such a diagnostic. A diagnostic is indispensable to identify the structural and governance deficiencies inhibiting prosecutorial independence and effectiveness. It is indispensable to expose the lingering ethical and cultural corrosion that undermines public confidence and morale, and it would be critical to defining the leadership profile, the skills, independence, and integrity required to restore credibility. The brief shows what a diagnostic would need to cover, and here it uses the Mokgoro Commission's report as an authoritative starting point. Not because the Mokgoro Commission report is the only source, but because it revealed the systemic weaknesses beyond individual misconduct that it was technically established to assess. First, any diagnostic must address institutional independence and political interference. Justice Mokgoro reminded us that the National Prosecuting Authority Act criminalizes interference. It called for serious measures against politicians and private actors who seek to influence prosecutions. Yet the risk persists because of the National Prosecuting Authority's structural relationship with the executive. A diagnostic must assess whether governance reforms since 2019 have materially insulated the National Prosecuting Authority. The brief points to concrete reform proposals that would guard against political interference, but require legislative changes. And again, Jean, representative of the Della Omar Institute, they're on public record as making these types of proposals, such as giving the National Prosecuting Authority its own accounting officer status and a separate budget vote, and allowing it to set its own salary dispensation to secure specialist skills. It also points to the practical reality of executive cooperation being withheld, including the question of access to the Zondo evidence repository, where the National Prosecuting Authority has reportedly been forced to subpoena material rather than have direct and unhindered access to that important source of evidence on which to build cases. Second, a diagnostic must address the leadership failure and ethical collapse and the persistence of weak accountability. Justice Mokgoro in her report found that Mqobajiba had dishonored her obligation to act impartially and compromised the National Prosecuting Authority's independence with serious damage to public confidence. Lawrence Mkhwebi's conduct similarly damaged the institution and violated prosecutorial duties. But the brief argues that recent events demonstrate how unresolved those pathologies remain. The childcare matter is used as a central illustration. There are multiple layers to the childcare example, but the point is clear. Disciplinary processes at senior levels are glacial and politically fraught. The National Director of Public Prosecutions cannot remove a Director of Public Prosecutions. She can only recommend action, and the President may act only on limited grounds. DPPs wield significant autonomy within their jurisdictions, and in practice often have greater day-to-day influence than the National Director of Public Prosecutions. The brief then uses concrete performance data to illustrate why this matters. Collapse in prosecutions and convictions in the Specialized Commercialized Crime Unit during Chauke's tenure, and again, I would point here to Jean's writing on this. Omissions in reporting, the withdrawal of the Kodwa McKay prosecution, the vagueness of the reasons, and the need for review. It also points to other examples that show structural shielding of problematic incumbents. The reassignment of Mopoino Noko after an internal finding, rather than prompt accountability. Protected disciplinary processes at levels below the level of Director of Public Prosecutions, and how the removal process is substantially more difficult if an official holds certain senior statuses. This section of the brief points to an important legislative point. Security of tenure for senior prosecutors has ossified into a system that shields incumbents and prevents renewal. The absence of public consultations in DPP appointments and their indefinite tenure until the age 65 with no fixed term created deep institutional rigidity. The conclusion drawn from Jean's analysis here is that reform should require public consultation for senior officials and fixed terms. Now, the brief is realistic. These legislative deficiencies will not be remedied before, certainly they were going to be remedied before December's appointment. We now have this window of 24 months, and we need to sort of move to try and ensure that these legislative deficiencies can be addressed. But the brief does insist that the selection process must not pretend that these constraints do not exist. Candidates should have been asked how they would navigate them, how they would enforce accountability, and how they would press within the constitutional framework for necessary reform. Third, the diagnostic must address structural dysfunction. Justice Mokgoro, in her report, pointed to blurred lines of accountability among DPPs, misuse of delegated authority, and a confused command structure vulnerable to manipulation. My brief argues that the dysfunction endures. It cites case examples not to rehearse media narratives, but to illustrate systemic fragility. Repeated filtering of high-profile corruption and organized crime matters, the New Lane retrial opportunity, the Omotoso case, and the trial court's excoriation of prosecutorial conduct, and the absence of visible disciplinary consequence, despite the gravity of judicial criticism, are used as illustration to speak to a recent structural and lingering structural dysfunction. The brief also discusses the extradition crisis and the Schultz litigation and the Chiloto case as an example of how poor institutional anticipation and risk management can imperil major matters. The point is not that mistakes shouldn't happen. Mistakes will always happen. The point is that when mistakes happen at systemic scale, they reveal the institutional weakness, the oversight failures, the weak legal risk management, and the insufficient support to prosecutorial teams in complex and politically sensitive matters. Taken together, these episodes point to the persistence of structural dysfunction. They raise questions about whether clear lines of reporting exist, whether prominent cases are being monitored in ways consistent with public confidence, and whether the institution has the agility to resource complex litigation. Finally, we come to the conclusion and the immediate steps for a credible process, again, sort of now with a slightly longer time horizon. The conclusion of the brief is straightforward. Appointing a National Director of Public Prosecutions without a clear understanding of the institutional condition of the institution and without parallel reform risks repeating a cycle of substitution without renewal. Legislative change can happen before the next appointment. Nonetheless, the selection process must confront and should have confronted the constraints openly. It should have tested the candidates against them and equipped the incoming National Director of Public Prosecutions to act within those constraints from day one. The brief ends with 7 immediate steps to the presidency and the Department of Justice, steps that are practical and that could shape what happened next, including what should be done before the next appointment cycle. So the first was to commission a rapid diagnostic, and that recommendation still stands. Engage an independent body, engage a body such as the Dullah Omar Institute, to synthesize existing evidence into a concise institutional health report to inform interviews and the president's decision. Second, the internal handover process should have been leveraged. The outgoing National Director of Public Prosecutions, then Shamila Batoy, indicated in an annual report that a comprehensive handover report was being compiled. A suitably redacted version should have been made available to shortlisted candidates and the panel, with interviews tied to its contents and risks. And again, I think as we head to a process in 24 months, we should be leveraging the internal handover process. And that should be made available to candidates who are going to be interviewed for the next NDPP role. Third, and here again, in terms of the most recent annual report, Shamila Batoy indicated that national case prioritization guidelines were being developed. Candidates should have been tested on their approach to revising, implementing, and resourcing those guidelines, especially where interdivisional coordination has seemed to fail. Fourth, the interviews should be structured to elicit candor and depth. And here this is a recommendation that might receive some pushback, but conduct at least part of each interview in private to allow for the probing of operational and integrity questions that would need to be asked sort of beyond studio lights. And then for there to be a robust reasons report explaining recommendations. And it should be mentioned here that, in fact, a number of civil society organizations during this most recent appointment process did write to the presidency, did write to the head of this panel asking for a reasons report, and at the conclusion of that process, subsequently asked for a reasons report to be provided. That has not been forthcoming. Fifth, close the expertise gap in terms of the panel interviewing. The panel's limited prosecutorial or non-existent prosecutorial experience should have been offset by convening a focused, largely public interview with the outgoing National Director of Public Prosecution on what attributes and leadership skills are most critical, and invite written input from former senior prosecutors. Sixth, to address integrity head-on, invite the National Director of Public Prosecutions, and again, I think this was a missed opportunity, so to have invited Ms. Batoy to clarify her prior statements on political interference and sabotage, and to respond to allegations implicating prosecutorial leadership, including those raised by General Mkhwanazi in relation to the investigating directorate against corruption. This would help calibrate expectation and provide a factual baseline for candidates' plans. And seventh, to set clear expectations with the public. The panel needed to communicate plainly the limits within which the next National Director of Public Prosecutions would operate, and the milestones by which their tenure should be judged, so that success measured against institutional reform and prosecutorial outcomes would be properly weighed. And again, I think given that we're seeing an appointment that is likely to last a maximum of 24 months, I think one has to be clear. The National Prosecuting Authority has to be clear and help manage the public's expectations as to what can be achieved within those 24 months. Handled in this way, the brief argues that the process should have married transparency with substance. Given where we now stand with the National Director of Public Prosecutions, who may only serve 24 months, this is no longer a matter of abstract best practice. It is a practical question about whether we use the short transitional period to build the foundations for recovery, or whether we allow another cycle of substitution to begin without much renewal. The National Director of Public Prosecutions, as the brief has made clear, can't fix the National Prosecuting Authority alone, but the appointment process and the transitional arrangements around it can be designed as a lever for institutional recovery rather than just another turn of the wheel. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to the comments.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Because we've got, I think, about 20 minutes left, we're going to be very brief and punchy in the kind of questions and engagement that we have. Obviously, Jean Redpath and Lawson Naidoo, who are both experts on the NPA, are available to us. Lawson, I'd just like your reaction to the paper that Nicole has presented, and particularly this issue of Andy Mothibi now walking into a situation where we saw this very bizarre public process of interviews, which was then ultimately subverted because they couldn't find anyone suitable, including obviously the furore over, amongst other things, the Menzi Simelane candidature or nomination. Walking into this now, how do you feel that Andy Mothibi has almost had his kind of candidature undermined by this process and the way that which it's unfolded? And how realistic is it for the public to expect him to be able to make the kind of far-ranging changes that Nicole has so pertinently outlined?
Thanks, Karen. I agree with what Nicole has said, and having read the brief as well. But I think it's a little bit unfair on Andy coming in. It wasn't his fault that his appointment came about in the way that he did. Where I think the presidency and the Minister of Justice erred was that they should have publicly interviewed Andy Mothibi as the president's nominee, effectively. And we've seen that before with the single nominees interviewed for the position of Chief Justice. So it would not have been unusual, and that would have, I think, established a level of public credibility. Those of us that work in this space, may know Andy a little bit, and I certainly welcome his appointment. I think, the fact that he probably only has 2 years left means that he's got to be quite focused. But it's not within his powers to make the changes that are necessary. These require legislative changes that need to emanate from the executive. We've had commitments from both the president and successive ministers of justice around issues of the financial and operational autonomy of the NPA, creating its own accounting officer, getting its funds directly from Parliament rather than through the Department of Justice. But, I think one other aspect I would like to introduce into the conversation is the very structure of the NPA. Nicole, I think, spoke about a diagnostic. And I think a lot of the issues, such as the independence of the NPA have been well documented and written about over many years. But we need to go back, I think, to the very structure of the NPA. This act was passed in the 1990s. It was really a relic of pulling together the attorneys general from the different provinces in the apartheid era, who didn't want to give up the powers that they have. So we have the situation where the National Director of Public Prosecutions has very little influence or say over prosecutions that actually take place. That power rests in the hands of the Directors of Public Prosecutions in the provinces. And that's a relic from the start of the Act. And I think Nicole made reference to the fact that the NDPP has little power to discipline deputy national directors or DPPs. That's the preserve of the presidency in terms of the current structure of the Act. And then there's this other imbalance also in the structure of the NPA, is that the senior leadership operates within the terms of the NPA Act, subject to discipline by the presidents or presidency-initiated disciplinary processes, whereas those lower down in the ranks of the NPA fall under the Public Service Act and its regulations in terms of discipline. So you've got these a two-tier system that operates there. So those are the some of the issues that I think would need to be addressed in terms of the structure of the NPA, rebalancing that, and I would argue giving the NDPP more power and then holding that NDPP accountable for the power that they do have. The one other point I want to make is around, and I think you touched on this as well, Nicole, I think you were quoting Jean in this regard, is the issue of the tenure, not just of the DPPs who were once appointed serve until the age of 65. I think there should be a limited tenure But that's going to go hand in hand with the other aspect of reform of the NPA that's required, which is to remove the salary constraints that are imposed by public service regulations. So that someone who's, say, appointed as a DPP at the age of 40, vacates office, say, after 7 years at the age of 47. You don't want to lose them to the institution. So there's got to be a mechanism to keep them in the system with all of that experience that they have, whilst allowing someone new to take over. Similarly, with the tenure of the NDPP, nobody's served 10 years as yet since 1998. Shamila's been the longest at 7. And I would argue that that tenure needs to be looked at and perhaps should be brought down to 7 years. As it is for many other constitutional office bearers. So those are some of the things that I think need to be dealt with, together with the issue of this constitutional statement that the Minister of Justice has final responsibility over the NPA. That's not really been unpacked anywhere. I know in the report of the Ginwala Commission, we did opine on that to a certain extent, but that needs to be unpacked properly especially in terms of what we're arguing for, which is the enhanced independence of the NPA. And then perhaps just a final point, Karen, at this juncture. Nicole spoke about, the fact that the handover report of the outgoing NDPP, Shamila Patoy. At a press briefing last month, she did say that a report had been prepared and was going to be handed over to Andy Matibi. Whether that's been accompanied by any engagements or discussions between them, I don't know. But what I would say is that it was a publicly available document from November last year, which was Advocate Batoy's affidavit to the ad hoc committee in Parliament. And if one reads that, she outlines the challenges that the NPA faces. So it's quite clear that neither the members of the interviewing panel nor any of the candidates had actually bothered to read that. It's a publicly available document. It highlights the challenges that the NPA faces at this point in time. So I think there is information out there, and Batoy has spoken on various occasions about the challenges that the office has faced over a period of time. So let me leave it there for now. Thanks, Gareth.
Thank you so much. Jean, obviously we've heard in Nicole's presentation that a huge amount of what she presented in that paper was actually based on your very excellent research. Given that, I'm not going to go into any sort of long question, but I'll just ask, what's your reaction to Nicole's points, and what do you think needs to be emphasized here in terms of the rehabilitation of what many may argue is an NPA, and I think Nicole argues is an NPA that's in crisis? Thank you.
I did actually prepare some slides to show the crisis that we are in. What has become absolutely clear over the years that the Dalla Omar Institute has been working on the NPA is that the problem is not just about the leadership, it's a structural problem. And in many senses, the legislation, as Lawson has pointed out in 1998, that was passed, the structural problems were inherent in that legislation. And as a result, we have seen a deterioration in performance as these structural problems compound each other over time. And because I've been in this business for some time, I can show you data going back all the way to 1998. So 1998 is a good baseline because it was the year in which the legislation was passed, creating the National Prosecuting Authority. Before that, as Lawson pointed out, we had these attorney generals. But at the time, we had around 500,000 cases that the NPA enrolled, that's prosecution services enrolled every year, around 200,000 convictions, and slightly more actually were sentenced to imprisonment, were admitted to prison. These are from various data sources that we had at the time. Fast forward to 2004, 2005, we have about 1 million cases enrolled, about 300,000 convictions, and markedly fewer going to prison. Now, obviously, there needed to be some adjustment in those numbers being imprisoned, and there were some appropriate adjustments. However, we can begin to see the beginnings of a deterioration, and soon after that was when the attack on the prosecuting authority began with the disbandment of the Scorpions. Fast forward 20 years, and we are now in a situation where the NPA enrolls fewer than it did almost 30 years ago, convicts half of what it did 30 years ago, and a very small number actually go into prison. So what actually happened over that time, what we had was a masking of what was going on under the radar. So here I've just got a data set from 2009. Between 2009 and 2018, it looked like things were hovering at around 300,000 convictions every year up until 2017. But what was really happening under the radar is that serious crime convictions were being replaced by drug convictions, which are much easier for both the police and the prosecution to secure, because typically you don't require witnesses, you just have the arresting officer, you just produce the drugs, and there you go. And what we actually got to around 2017 was those were about to exceed the serious crime convictions. And then we had the Constitutional Court judgment, which said private, possession of small amounts of marijuana, enforcing that infringed on privacy. And then we see a collapse in the numbers following that. It's really unmasked what was going on behind the scenes. Around 2020, we begin to see the beginnings of a recovery, but we are still nowhere near where we were a long time ago. I was asked to particularly look at where are we particularly struggling, and Nicole has alluded to the Specialized Commercial Crime Unit of the NPA, which is supposed to deal with the serious commercial offenses. And we can see around the time where the Scorpions still existed. Now, Specialized Commercial Crime Unit was separate from the Scorpions then. Nevertheless, they dealt with many serious offenses, and we can see that the decreasing trend from around 1,500 convictions of what was supposed to be the more serious offenses down to around 300 in the most recent year for which we have data. And this is all in the annual reports of the NPA. Now, the reports all talk about the cases becoming more complex, etc., etc. But the bottom line is that this is simply not enough to deal with the extent of the problem that we now have in South Africa. And here, if we look at what is reported to the police every year, has gone from fewer than 60,000 to over 140,000 commercial crimes reported. And back in 2006, we could expect 3 in every 100 reported commercial crimes to be matched by a conviction by the SCCU, which is actually not so bad internationally. Typically, we're looking at around 10% or fewer. But now we are in the realm of 2 in every 1,000 reported crimes being matched by an SCCU conviction. So the scale of the response needed from the prosecuting authority to the scale of the problem is simply not being matched at all. And we believe at the Della Oma Institute that this is structural. It is part of the way in which the Prosecuting Authority Act was created. There are a range of problems. We've talked about the problems with appointments of the senior people. There are problems with dismissals. There are problems with who becomes a prosecutor. There is no requirement in law for a prosecutor to be admitted as an attorney or as an advocate. This creates a secondary system of legally qualified people who are not free to leave the NPA and continue their work at the same level. So it's an independence issue as well. Lawson has talked about the salary problems in the way that the senior management are treated in a senior management way, and because their increases didn't match that of the prosecuting authority as a whole, we ended up in a situation where more senior people were earning less than less senior people. So structural problems with salaries, problems with appointments and removals, problems with who is recruited into the NPA, and problems with hiring the specialist skills that are needed for the serious state capture cases. And here there's Section 38 of the Act, which talks about getting the approval of the minister, the financial situation being covered by the Minister of Finance, a high-level interaction, which is simply not appropriate. The NPA doesn't have a budget to hire in the specialist skills it may not need, whether they be forensic analysts or senior counsel, that they might need in very, very serious cases and very high-profile cases. And as a result, the investigating directorate which is an attempt to claw back some of what the Scorpions had, even though it only started out with 35 people. This is what the data is showing in terms of investigations authorized and matters enrolled. It's nowhere near what we need to be seeing. And that is fundamentally about the NPA not being able to hire in the ad hoc skills that they need in an easy fashion. It has to go through the minister. And we know that there's been quite a lot of headbutting around resources for the NPA. They need to have their own budget. They need to be able to control this. There needs to be a line item for bringing in additional skills as and when required. And I just want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that we've gathered together a lot of the material around reform of the NPA, which we think must be legislative. There must be a legislative component on a website called prosecutionsproject.org.za. And we do hope that others will join us in this project. We think it is absolutely crucial. Nicole is absolutely right. There should have been a transparent process. It should be set in law. It should require reasons. And we also need a process for the removal of the top people. And as Lawson said, we also need term limits. So many things could create a much more dynamic prosecuting authority, which synergizes with the legal system in a much better fashion. And this is possible with reform to the legislation. And I'm going to stop sharing there. That's the input I prepared for today.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think those statistics speak for themselves. Just in terms, and this is a question for both Lawson and of course, Nicole, we will bring you in and feel free to interrupt because obviously this is hugely insightful to you as well. This is an interruption zone. So if you feel like you want to contribute, please do. But a question for all of you. We've seen the most astounding evidence, of apparent corruption of very senior police officials within the police service, allegedly receiving benefits from, amongst other people, Vusi Musi, Kat Matlala. But given the kind of statistics that Jean is speaking to of this abysmal conviction rate when it comes to particularly commercial crimes, and I would expect corruption too, Jean, how is the South African public, which is now primed to expect real accountability in terms of the criminal justice system, going to hit this wall of an NPA, which on the stats that you've just provided, doesn't seem up to the task?
Yeah, I think that is a real risk of the Madlanga Commission process, that the expectations have been created. People have also made prejudgments about who is good and who is bad, when actually the picture is very murky all around. But I think if we want to know where to start, we have to strengthen the National Prosecuting Authority. There are good prosecutors in there operating in a very, very difficult, very structurally inappropriate structure. And if we can start with reform of the Prosecuting Authority, that is where we can start. And two ministers have already said they understand the need for the financial independence of the Prosecuting Authority, but there simply hasn't been movement from within the Department of Justice, which would be responsible for writing the legislation. And I think what's needed is public pressure to strengthen the Prosecuting Authority, to make it politically impossible not to do so.
I think what you raise is a valuable point, and I'll ask Nicole to address this, and Lawson as well. There is a public rhetoric around the NPA that, for want of a better term, they're either useless or they are, fundamentally on the versions of certain of the people that have testified at, amongst other things, the Madlanga Commission potentially compromised. But I mean, the point you raise about cost is very important, because we saw the Machela Koko case collapse precisely because the NPA was unable to fund a data analyst to analyze all the data that was seized from Machela Koko's various devices. And that then created a postponement, which saw that case collapse, with obvious questions around the magistrate's role, which is a whole other separate issue. But do you think the public are joining the dots between this fundamental issue of the funding and the failures of the NPA down the line to actually get matters to court and to keep them in court and to run trials? I'll ask all of you the same question.
Thanks, Karen. I mean, my sense is no, they don't. And I think, to some extent, and I mean, this is, I think, specific to South Africa, but it's a feature that we're seeing, around the world at the moment. But I think a kind of public is being buried in an avalanche of information, right? They're not sort of accountability processes that are worked through. And so what you're doing is, being presented supposedly with transparency, but then there are no consequences which follow on that. And I think what we're seeing in South Africa is just the public being sort of buried in scandal after scandal after scandal, unable necessarily to try and join the dots. There are obviously situations where they're saying there seems to be credible information that indicates this person has committed sort of grave wrongdoing and should be punished, held to account. That's not happening. But I think also if you're kind of conditioning this beleaguered public, right, and I think it is feeding into this kind of these polarizing dynamics, is that we're moving away from, we're facing extremes, but we're also unwilling to sort of follow nuance and complexity, right? And so some of this is essentially about how do you work up these cases, what is required, what are the resources, right? And so it's not necessarily that it's because, I mean, sometimes it is bad faith actors, but sometimes it's not the bad faith actors, right? It's about a systemic situation which is bedeviling and ensuring failure. And I think we are, at a time in this country especially, but again, I mean, these are currents that we're seeing around the world, where we're not having a public that is receptive to that. And that's why, I mean, in the brief, I do speak about this statistic, which I think is terrifying for us, that in the last 3 years, we have apparently seen a rise, from 22% of our population in favor of military rule to 49%. And I think it is just, indicating the deep skepticism on the part of the public with the institutions of our constitutional democracy. And as I say, I think that should be terrifying to us.
And also just on that, when you have a sort of a disengagement with the legitimacy of the justice system, you see this complete support publicly of cops just opening fire on suspects. Exactly. And so-called criminals just getting taken out. And we've had that kind of dynamic, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. And then, obviously human rights and those kind of things, and you'll get accused of being a bleeding heart liberal, but like those things then go out the window. I just wanted to get both Jean and Lawson on the state that the NPA finds itself in, and this idea of what Nicole has just highlighted, this gap between people's understanding of what the NPA is capable of and their expectations of swift and heavy justice, which then often translates into a support for what could best be described as extrajudicial killings.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a real problem, and the NPA is the linchpin of all accountability in South Africa. If it's corruption, if it's abuse by police officers, whatever it is, the buck stops with the NPA. And if it is not in a position to act without fear, favor, or prejudice as required by Section 1794 of the Constitution, that is a huge problem for the constitutional project of our country. And yeah, I can't emphasize more that the way it is structured in terms of the legislation is not fit for the purpose of being the linchpin of accountability in our democracy. And it's not the fault of the people in the institution. It's structural, it's systemic. And we can see that sometimes the need for external skills is realized. For example, in the Murodai Charlotte case and in the Constitutional Court, the NPA hired 5 senior counsel to argue that matter. So when it matters, that is realized. And that was also a strategy adopted by the Scorpions when they were creating the precedents around asset forfeiture, because it wasn't accepted. There was quite a lot of civil society suspicion around this idea that the state could seize people's assets. And so they went with hiring the big names in private practice to actually argue the cases so that the judiciary would take them seriously, would take the cases seriously, and so that good precedent could be established. Now, we would love to see the NPA do that, but there isn't a line item for them to do that, and they don't have the control over doing that. Now, I think in the Constitutional Court case that I'm referring to, the minister herself was going to be embarrassed. And so, there was the political will to put forward 5 senior counsel. That is the kind of investment we need, not just of counsel, but of specialist analysts, forensic accountants, etc., etc. And those kind of people do not want to work permanently for government or for the National Prosecuting Authority. They have to be brought in as and when required, and the budget isn't there to hire them permanently. So, there has to be a realization that as we go through this process of reforming the NPA, of bringing in good skills and reforming the way it operates to improve that, there also needs to be the short term of being able to hire on an ad hoc basis those that are needed in the precedent-setting cases.
I mean, we know this is an issue. It's been raised again and again. Lawson, what do you think informs the apparent reluctance around this resourcing issue and this financial independence issue with the NPA, the NDPP being an accounting officer? This has been an issue that's been raised again and again and again. So why is it not being dealt with? Because it's seemingly such an easy win to ensure the effectiveness of the National Prosecuting Authority.
I wish I knew the answer to that, Karen. You and I were both there during the Ginwala Commission of Inquiry, and this was a factor that loomed large over that inquiry in terms of the role that Menzi Simelane, then the Director General of the Department of Justice, had played in relation to the NPA and I might add to the Scorpions as well. So these are enduring problems, and we've said there's been political commitments that these things have to be corrected, but the legislation we still haven't seen, and that's something I think Andy Mothibi needs to emphasize to the Minister of Justice, that this is now urgent, that it needs to happen. Before I come on to this point, I just want to say one. The other issue that concerns me is that, as far as I know, I think all of the Deputy National Director positions are vacant at the moment.
Yes, yeah.
And that's something that, the President needs to apply his mind to very, very urgently. I would agree with what was said earlier about there needing to be public consultation in those processes. But those appointments need to happen soon, because Andy's going to be leaving in 2 years. Those NDPP should be forming the cohort of who takes over. And if we don't appoint them soon enough, we're not going to have that experienced cohort or knowledge of the NPA. So that was something I forgot to say earlier. The only other point I'd make in relation to this issue around the state of the NPA and how it's perceived publicly is we have a tendency to focus on the NPA in a silo. It is part of the criminal justice system. We cannot look at or measure the effectiveness of the NPA without looking at the other component parts. SAPS, the Hawks, crime intelligence, and then the courts themselves as well. Karen, how long a case has taken, the postponements and, all of that. So we've got to look at the whole criminal justice value chain and fix all of it. You can't just fix one part of it if the other parts of it are not working. So I think there's a real opportunity, and perhaps it's the last thing I'll say, is the Madlanga Commission, I hope, is going to give us this opportunity to look at the whole spectrum of this criminal justice sector, identify the key issues in each of them that need to be addressed, and then put in place a plan of action to actually do that.
We have this propensity within the criminal justice environment that's been pointed out many, many times, where well-resourced litigants will pursue meaningless and futile legal challenges to the prosecution as a mechanism to delay them. And we've seen this in a series of very high-profile cases. And obviously, my favorite, of course, being the Jacob Zuma matter, where the NPA has now launched this extraordinary application to say, he can bring legal challenges to seek down his recusal, et cetera, et cetera. But while he's doing that, we want this trial to run. Obviously, the judge in that case is now waiting for an SCA decision, which he says will impact on his decision in regard to that application. But how important do you think it is for this kind of paralysis around high-profile corruption cases, which is often caused by the accused themselves bringing legal challenges, to the NPA pushing back against that, and ultimately there being a court ruling that says this cannot be a strategy that delays trials. These applications can be brought in parallel to them. We're not disavowing anyone's constitutional rights, but this cannot be a mechanism by which trials are then delayed. I mean, I'd like all of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. That's why I say one has to look at the whole of the value chain in the system, including the courts and including the way judges deal with these interlocutory matters in particular. And then, the other point in relation to the resourcing of the NPA itself. I mean, a lot of these, in many of these high-profile cases, the people with seemingly endless pockets that, bring together huge legal teams to defend themselves. And the NPA is struggling to get the kind of assistance it needs in terms of forensic skills and the like. And one would have thought that given, the repeated pronouncements from the president and the members of the executive about the commitment to fight corruption, that there would be a concerted effort to give the NPA the resources to win particularly these high-profile cases, because it begins to build momentum, it begins to build public confidence in the system and our ability as a state to prosecute state capture and corruption offenders. And again, so there's a mismatch between the political rhetoric and the actual actions of government.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicole?
So I just wanted to pick up on a point that Lawson has mentioned about the fact that sort of the tier beneath the National Director of Public Prosecutions, Deputy National Directors, that so many of those posts are vacant. And I think, we find ourselves at a juncture where, despite the process which we might wish had been better in terms of the appointment of Advocate Andy Mutibi, I mean, by all accounts, this is a man who has performed really well as head of the SIU. All of us have to sort of wish him well in this new post. He is constrained, as the brief makes clear, right? There are all sorts of constraints that he's inheriting. Some of the reforms that need to be made are sort of outside of his realm, but one can't help but wish that he makes very clear in a way that, I mean, I thought watching those interviews, I mean, I know that Hermione Crinier didn't necessarily endear herself to the selection panel, obviously, because there was no single candidate that was recommended. But she was very clear, like, if these reforms are not put in place, I'm not going to look to complete my term. I will be out of there. And I think he has to know he's, I'm sure, a lot of public, he didn't make himself available in the first round. We have to speculate that a lot of pressure was, placed on him to make himself available. I hope he comes out publicly and says, I do have this short protracted term. Here is what I intend to do. And basically, it's not going to be worth my while or the country's while unless we see real implementation of reforms that I alone cannot put in place. That requires the legislative reforms that we've already had sort of members of the executive ostensibly support. And that requires allowing me to staff a kind of leadership cohort that, is reform-minded. We share the same mandate, and we are going to be able to put in place over the course of the next 24 months or even less, the foundations that ultimately will allow for the reform of the National Prosecuting Authority, which we just haven't, and up till this point, been able to see. And so that would be very much my hope of his strength, understanding that he is constrained, but given the shortness of his tenure and what we have to anticipate happen behind the scenes, would I think be a really valuable and critical intervention at this point.
I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the NDPP actually takes home a far like a less of a salary than the head of the SIU does. And that was, from my understanding, one of the main issues why Mothibi was initially reluctant, or may have been reluctant, to take that position. And one can only assume that he would have been offered something on equivalent. But again, you know, in terms of the staffing of the upper structures of the NPA, that is not going to happen with good people if you're not offering them adequate remuneration. You have people who could work in the private sector and earn insane amounts of money. You want the best of the best, so you need to remunerate them adequately. Jean, I just wanted your reaction to this issue of the staffing, the huge growing staffing gaps in the NPA, and this issue of being unable to replace them, where people, I think it is a salary issue, but that you're not getting the best, unfortunately, you know, arguably, to the point where all these people are interviewed for this position and you can't come up with a single candidate that you view as suitable.
Yeah, I don't think it's only salary. I think that, I mean, would you want to work at the NPA? I mean, seriously, right now, right now, the reputation it has, the difficulties it faces. I mean, Hermione Cronier spoke about not being able to secure officers, not being able to secure the basics to do your job. And many prosecutors are working in that situation, working in courts where the toilets don't work. You know, where it's a very, very difficult, unattractive for the best and the brightest, unfortunately, and they can earn a lot more outside. And so, you know, the whole way in which it has been imagined needs to change. And while I agree with Lawson that the whole system has been affected by state capture, the thing about the NPA is it's the smallest part of the system, and so it's the easiest to fix. I mean, when you're talking about the police, you're talking about 200,000 people. You know, that's going to take to turn that ship around. It's going to be tricky. Whereas, you know, the NPA is possibly around 6,000 now. It's much more amenable to fixing, and the legislative reforms are clear. And as you said, once we start having successes, it will develop momentum, it'll become a more attractive place to work, etc., and it will become a place like the Scorpions were. The best and the brightest wanted to work in the Scorpions. Literally, they recruited the best law graduates straight out of university, sent them to the FBI, although we wouldn't do that now. You know, it was exciting. And we don't have that excitement anymore. And we need to get it back, and we can get it back. I think that South Africa has a great ability to renew itself and to turn things around in a relatively quick space of time. But I think in this situation, we're going to need the legislative change.
Well, we are wrapping up in 11 minutes at past, so people can go and get their lunch and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. But I wanted to ask each of you, if you could identify a single reform that you believe could be game-changing for the NPA, and you had the ability to say to Andy Mothibi, outside the constraints of, you know, obviously that his role is confined by, to do one thing that you think could make a difference, what would that one thing be? I'll start with you, Nicole.
Right now, absent the legislative reforms, I think what he requires is the backing of the president, who is going to, you know, fast track disciplinary processes that need to be made, appoint the team that he needs around him if he is going to be able to sort of entrench the reforms. And I think spearhead make the executive obviously can't, but it certainly can be a champion of the legislative reforms that need to happen within Parliament. And so, you know, you can't have, as we saw, I mean, I think by the time Shamila put on the president's desk the recommendation of disciplinary action against Andrew Chauke, that was already 3 years into her tenure. It seems inexplicable to me, but the fact that the president then sat on that for 2 years, even more inexplicable. And again and again and again, we see the president just basically failing to act to defend this key institution. So, you know, obviously, again, it's on the basis of speculation, but action was taken. Advocate Mothibi was prevailed on to make himself available. And that has to be followed up with the kind of executive support that until now we haven't seen. And so that's what I mean, it's ephemeral, but I think for any of the other changes to happen, you have to have that, and you have to have it prompt and speedily, not 3 years down the line. So that's what I would certainly wish for him and for the National Prosecuting Authority more generally, if this next 2 years is going to be a critical turnaround period.
So it's actually more about the president than it is about what Andy Matibi can do. Jean,
until
I just
the
wanted to ask
legislative reforms come in.
Yes, no, it's an absolutely absolutely important point. And Jean, I just wanted to ask you the same question.
Well, in the absence of reform to Section 38, the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Finance could give, a blank slate, well, a blank check for the best to come and fight these cases. And I think that is what we need. I'm not casting aspersions on the people in the NPA, but when you are facing people with very deep pockets, who are hiring the best and the brightest, you need to fight fire with fire, and that's what we need.
Absolutely. Lawson?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree. I think the NPA need to be given the resources to fight these battles that we expect them to fight and to win, and easing the use of the Section 38 provision is going to be critical in that regard, because bringing down corrupt syndicates, organized criminal syndicates, is going to takes a lot of work. It's not just about prosecutors; it's about the investigating teams behind that, the digital and forensic skills that are required that don't exist within the NPA. They have to be brought in from outside, and government can facilitate that, and that's really what Matibi is going to require, because as I said earlier, in order to to shift public perceptions about the NPA and about whether we have the capacity, and I agree with Jean that we do have the capacity to turn this around. But it's not going to just happen by itself, or just by having a new NDPP. It's going to take a lot more than that, and those legislative changes have to follow very soon thereafter.
And also, I think the important thing to stress here is we are not in an ANC-dominated government anymore. We are in a government of national unity, where we have various different political parties and a public that is sick and tired of criminality and wants to see things change. So, that pressure that the public can exert, the ordinary people, the people who are watching this can exert on their duly elected representatives to push for that is very powerful, and it's very important, because I think we're at a crossroads now in terms of accountability for this kind of crime, and it's pivotal that it is ensured. Iva, I'm going to go back to you now. Thank you to everyone who's participated in this. I mean, I think it's been fascinating. And, Nicole Fritz's paper is available if you want to read it. It's definitely worth looking into, provides profound insight, obviously draws on a lot of the research that Jean and others have done, but a very, very valuable insight into the NPA, where it is and how it got there and what needs to happen in order for it to change. So thank you so much, Iva.
Oh, Karen, thank you for marvelously facilitating that conversation. I think a great discussion. I think some very important points have come up. Nicole Fritz, thank you very much for doing this work for the New South Institute. We are looking forward to an ongoing relationship in this regard. Thank you to Jean, and thank you very much to Lawson for being part of this conversation. I think a very worthwhile afternoon. Thank you very much to everybody that participated and stayed through the conversation. We look forward to many more of these sorts of discussions. I think we're done. Thank you very much, everybody.